I think we will go ahead and get started. We still have a few people making their way out of the waiting room, but we will go ahead and get started. So thank you everybody for being here today. We're really happy to have you join us for this celebration of Constitution Day and also National Voter Registration Day. So two exciting civic reasons for you to be engaged in thinking about politics and government. So we're happy to have you here with us. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that if you're here for cultural event credit as a student, I'm glad that you're here already because one of the requirements is to be on time. Another one is to stay for the entirety of the event. Another requirement is to be safe while you're watching this event, which means you can't be driving or doing something like that for cultural event credit. You also can't be just doing other things like working while you're watching the cultural event. For the credit, you need to be paying attention and on your screen and with your camera on for the entirety of the event in order to be able to get credit. So to get us started, thank you again for being here for Winthrop's annual Constitution Day event. Each year, we seek to celebrate the Constitution and our founding by focusing on different aspects of the Constitution and how they apply to our 21st century life. In the past, we've looked at the First Amendment, freedom of speech, the Second Amendment, right to bear arms, voting rights in numerous different ways, freedom of expression, and much, much more. Today, we will seek to get a better understanding of a truly 21st century issue, and that is the use of facial recognition technology and how it applies to the Constitution. Even though our founders could not have anticipated such an issue arising when they wrote the Constitution and Bill of Rights, they did in fact lay a trail that we can follow as we examine the implementation of this practice and think about who we want to be as a nation in this regard. Questions such as how much privacy do we trade for security? And is facial recognition technology an illegal seizure of our personal information have come up in recent years. Our speakers will work to share their perspectives with you on this topic. But before we begin, this event is sponsored by the John C. West Forum on Politics and Policy. Our goal is to bring understanding of policy and political issues to Winthrop students and to all South Carolinians. At Winthrop, we seek to cultivate a sense of responsibility grounded in our respect for one another as both students and members of larger communities. To that end, we ask that all audience members show their respect to the presenters and fellow audience members at this event by avoiding disruptive behavior. We ask that you keep your microphone on mute throughout the event. If you have questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat. And again, if you're trying to get cultural event credit, make sure that you leave your camera on and be actively paying attention for the entirety of the event, that you be on time, that you stay until the end, and please also do not drive, work, or engage in other outside activities during the event if you want cultural event credit. We have two speakers today. The first one is Ms. Candace Carroll. Welcome, Ms. Carroll. Candace is the State Director of Americans for Prosperity. She is an upstate South Carolina native who has served with the Americans for Prosperity for about 5 years now. Before joining the organization as field director, she served on Jeb Bush's presidential campaign, as well as in development roles for the Heritage Foundation and Winthrop University. Candace graduated from Winthrop University in 2009, so she's our very own alum, with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and a focus on public policy and administration. Candace spearheads several statewide policy coalitions, including but not limited to the repeal of a certificate of need, criminal justice reform, and K-12 education reform. She also regularly provides commentary to South Carolina news outlets regarding Americans for Prosperity initiatives and goals. Mr. Frank Knack is our second speaker. He is the executive director of the South Carolina American Civil Liberties Union, and he's been in that role since January 2020. Frank previously worked at the ACLU's national offices in New York and DC and with other ACLU affiliates in Virginia and Texas. Most recently, Frank served as the executive director of the Montana Innocence Project and the Alabama Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. Frank has successfully led legislative and administrative reform efforts in multiple states in the areas of criminal justice, school-to-prison pipeline, government surveillance, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, and capital sentencing. He regularly testifies on human rights issues before state legislative and administrative body, and he is also regularly interviewed by media outlets regarding ACLU's legislative priorities. So welcome to both of you. I'm really glad to have you here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The format of today's event, I wanted to give you that before we get started so that everybody knows what's coming. Our speakers will each spend 15 to 20 minutes discussing the topic from their areas of expertise. Once they finish, we're going to have time for questions. I've pre-written some questions that are going to get us started, but I also am looking to have your questions in the chat. So as you make your way through the event and you think of something that you would like to know from one of the speakers, please feel free to put it in there. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the event. And I'll try to get to all of your questions, or at least as many as we can in the time that we're allotted. We will finish the event by 12:15 at the latest. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being respectful. Thank you for listening to our speakers. We're going to get started with Ms. Carol. She's our first speaker today.
Thanks so much, Karina, for having me. I really appreciate being here today. And Frank, it's always a pleasure to work with you, especially in the criminal justice reform space. So just a quick overview of Americans for Prosperity for those who may not be aware of who we are or the work that we do. We are a national grassroots organization. We are a nonpartisan organization that believes in breaking down the barriers that inhibit individuals from realizing their full potential, whether those are external barriers that'll get addressed at the state house or at the federal level by changing some of the laws to allow for less regulations in our lives, or looking at internal barriers. We do a lot of trainings for folks when it comes to just how do I even testify before a committee? How do I know who my elected official is? So really excited to be here today. We do a tremendous amount of work on criminal justice reform. And so when Professor Moyan reached out about this opportunity, was thrilled to join and always happy to come back to Winthrop. Really enjoyed my time there as a student and all of these cultural event opportunities for sure. So just to kind of kick it off, so as Professor Moyan mentioned, our founders, of course, couldn't really predict the future of where we are now as a country. And we do know that, you know, at that time, when someone wanted to have a private conversation, they could simply step away from others and look around to make sure that they were not being overheard or that no one saw them. And today, much of our communication with others has moved to this online platform, exactly what we're using today, Zoom, Microsoft Teams. I know you guys use a lot of others as well. However, while the medium of the communication may have changed, the principles have not. So we firmly believe that individuals ought to be able to engage in private communication free from unwarranted government surveillance. And the language of the Fourth Amendment provides no exemptions or exceptions to the requirement that the government secure a warrant, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. And so in recent decades, as our digital communication technologies have rapidly changed and expand, government agencies, as you can imagine, have also sought to expand their surveillance programs in ways that unfortunately sometimes do violate both the letter and the spirit of the Fourth Amendment without being required to prove their benefit to public safety or for national security. And the federal government in particular has increasingly found creative ways to avoid securing these warrants when it comes to domestic investigations by utilizing programs in the seizure of sensitive data that have previously been protected by the Fourth Amendment and can be a violation of countless innocent Americans' constitutional rights. And our organization, we do share the concerns that the ACLU does have when it comes to overall government surveillance, and believes that this private data, though it may be utilized by law enforcement, it needs to be treated differently than private companies such as Target or Walmart that may be, utilizing facial recognition technology, because we do believe that government has a right to make sure that they are adhering to the Constitution and that we are not having our liberties taken away for a legitimate or illegitimate monopoly when it comes to the use of force. So just wanted to set that groundwork there, and really digging into, why folks are using more of this facial recognition technology. As you guys know, cameras can not only record images, but they also can match those images against one another. As we were waiting on attendees to hop on, Professor Boyan and I were even talking today about a picture. Someone could be in the background of a picture, right? And that gets picked up by facial recognition devices. And so often these devices, unfortunately, are, you may not be aware that your picture is getting picked up. And there are times and spaces for that. So just to kind of use an example of, let's say, a positive use case. Let's imagine, unfortunately, a little bit of a dark scenario, but if a child is abducted by a stranger, imagine how quickly the child's family, by sharing an electronic photo with police, they might be able to use that facial recognition technology to identify their child much more quicker when they're out in the field looking for this individual. Unfortunately, there are abuses that may happen on the operator side of the system by allowing for that image to be stored longer than an agreed upon period of time. Let's say, for example, 7 days, 10 days, whatever that agreed upon time, that picture sometimes stays in the law enforcement databases for much, much longer than that. And so we believe that there should be an agreed upon time set, that information should be stored. And then we need to law enforcement needs to get rid of that image so that it's no longer being stored in their system. We also believe that government and law enforcement uses of facial recognition should be open to audit for biases and for other civil liberty offenses, which I know Frank will touch on as well, because we want to make sure that our law enforcement officers are not, leaning into, whether intentionally or unintentionally, biases when they're looking at this facial recognition technology. And there are things that lawmakers can do to make sure when they are writing the laws that the LEOs are then going to enforce on the streets. When they're writing these laws, they can make sure that there are specific wordings in there to respond to these fears that this facial recognition technology may be used in an inappropriate way or may not be open for biases. So, they can set up an audit time period, for example. We also believe that lawmakers should consider, when they're looking at this facial recognition technology, that they should consider passing laws that require notice and consent from consumers before the biometric data can be used for specific purposes, excluding security purposes. Laws that allow state attorney generals to sue if they determine companies have violated those requirements. And finally, that they require a violation to have resulted in harm before someone can be prosecuted, and that we're not just going off of assumptions. And so we believe that if lawmakers follow those three principles when looking to pass laws, especially when it comes to this facial recognition technology, that will help ensure that any regulations will protect privacy that is set forth, and that we're all guaranteed under the Fourth Amendment. So I'll stop there and kick it over to Frank, and would love to answer any questions that you guys have.
Well, thanks, Candace, and always great to be with you and talk with you about these issues. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you all today. My name is Frank Knack with the ACLU in South Carolina. And for those who are not familiar with the ACLU, we, like AFP, are a national organization, work to defend and protect basic rights and freedoms enshrined in the constitutions at the federal level and then at the state levels. The National ACLU was founded over 100 years ago in 1920. And the ACLU in South Carolina was founded back in 1968. And so we work on a whole variety of issues from national security to racial justice, LGBTQ, women's rights and abortion access, et cetera. And privacy and technology is one of the major issues that we've really started to dig into, particularly in the digital age. And, I think before we get into the specifics about facial recognition, I think, just to set a few baseline parameters, I think would be helpful. I think oftentimes this debate gets hijacked by those who say, you either are for technology or against technology. And that's, as Candace was discussing, that's not where we think this debate should be or is appropriate to be. This is not about whether these tools are valuable. It's about whether we have guardrails in place prior to these tools being deployed. And that, from our perspective, is the necessary component that has not happened. And I think, what we often also hear in these debates is that, privacy is dead, that people no longer care about privacy. And it's much easier when we're all in a room together, but like, at least virtually, can you raise your hands? Do you have passwords on your emails? Do you have, blinds on your home? Do you care about, whether someone can look at your search history in your Google search, for example? And I think, I would imagine if we were all in a room together, I would see a lot of hands raised. And I think that really shows that this debate is not whether privacy is dead, but it's about who controls our privacy. And from our perspective, it really should be us at the individual level who controls our privacy. And I think it's important to note that when we're talking about privacy, we're not talking about secrecy. We're merely talking about control. And what a good example of that is that, my medical records, I don't keep those secret, but I control who has access to those. So I give my doctor permission to have access to my medical records. So, and I think oftentimes what we hear from those who are pushing for increased surveillance is that there's this, zero-sum game where you're either, for security or you're for privacy. And that, people don't care about privacy anymore, that particularly young folks don't care about privacy. And I think, particularly anyone in the digital age, understands that encryption, understands that strong password protections are vital to protecting our information. And so I think that false choice, I started at the ACLU. I was an undergrad intern at the DC office about a week before 9/11. And so I was in DC on 9/11 when the planes hit New York City and then hit the Pentagon. And, that experience at the ACLU really showed me why it is so important for organizations like ours to exist, but also why it isn't so, as Candace talked about, why it's so important to remember the principles involved. And so, over the month plus after 9/11, various iterations of what would become the Patriot Act were getting thrown around. They were being done, with very little oversight, almost full unanimous support by members of Congress. The ACLU at the time was being told that we were, somehow supporting, bad people because we thought that privacy protections should be followed, that our constitutional right to privacy and Fourth Amendment protection should apply even in times of crisis like, the post 9/11 era. And I think history has proven we were correct in that assessment. I think it's important to note that even government actors like the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, we were told at the time you have to either, surrender your privacy to secure your safety. That was, if we wanted to be safe, we had to let the Patriot Act go through. And I think it's really important to note that, in the decade after, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which was the kind of bipartisan government entity that was brought together at the federal level to analyze the effectiveness of the Dragnet surveillance programs that were authorized under the Patriot Act. And so this is the things that were legally authorized, not the things that we later found out through Snowden disclosures and other whistleblowers that where the government had, even gone beyond what the Congress had authorized them to do. But even looking at the basic programs that the Patriot Act authorized, they could not find one single example of where Dragnet surveillance prevented some type of attack. And so I think right there shows that we need to kind of really get beyond the rhetoric of fear that is often used by those at the federal level in response to acts of terror, or at the state level when we hear these, we need to increase surveillance technologies because crime or because of X. and get back to the basic realization that these tools in and of themselves do not make us safer, and that we need to kind of really fundamentally reassess the debate around these tools and ensure that we have guardrails in place before they are deployed. And so, I think as Candace mentioned, a couple of examples of, how these technologies can be positive. And so, I think one of the big debates a couple of years ago was around automatic license plate readers. And so these are cameras that can be, attached to police vehicles, and they can scan every license plate that they drive by. And, as Candace was noting, the debate is really not whether we should have ALPRs, it's how that information is stored, who has access to it, how long that information is stored. And, because ALPRs can serve a very valid purpose. If there's an Amber Alert or a senior alert and a law enforcement vehicle, happens to scan that plate and gets a hit, that's a very positive, helpful public safety tool. But where the problem lies is when there's no control over that information, when all of that ALPR information can go into these vast government databases. And I think while having one automatic license plate reader, it takes a picture of the license plate and geolocates where that plate was at the time. And so one picture in and of itself is not deeply problematic. But when you take all the collective plates that are being scanned and they go into centralized databases, you can actually predict with scary, with fancy algorithms, with scary accuracy, people's lives. If you put ALPRs around a church, for example, they can scan who's going into that church and who's not. If they put them around a political event, they can scan who's going in and who's not. If they put it around an abortion clinic, they can scan who's going in and who's not. All things that are deeply troubling and things that the government in and of itself, without a judicial check, should not, with the executive branch or law enforcement, should not be able to do. And, again, it's the use of these technology to get around constitutional safeguards. The Supreme Court has made clear that organizations like ACLU or AFP, we don't need to give over our membership list absent a government warrant. But with an ALPR or facial recognition technology, they can merely set that up outside of a membership meeting and know exactly who's going. And if they set it up regularly, they would not only know who our membership is, but who our most active members are. And that's deeply troubling, particularly considering that there's no real checks on that power right now. At the federal level right now, with regard to facial recognition technology, there are zero checks on its use. And at the state level, again, we are far behind other states in terms of our ability to to kind of rein in the abusive use of this technology. And so talk a little bit about facial recognition technology, and I think why we are so concerned about this, even compared with other technologies. ALPRs, which I mentioned, enable the government to collect, mass troves of license plate data. That's still a license plate and not necessarily connected to an individual. I might borrow my wife's car, for example, and drive somewhere. And so they don't necessarily know with absolute certainty who's in that vehicle. Other technologies like stingrays, which are these tools that law enforcement use that mimic cell phone towers. And so like when I'm walking around with my cell phone, it's constantly pinging the closest tower and providing information. And what these stingrays do is they mimic the tower, and they can actually pull information off of your phone. But as Candace mentioned, the individualized requirement of the Fourth Amendment is impossible with certain technologies like stingrays, because stingrays don't limit to one, they pull everything in. And so while law enforcement may say they're going after one person, what they're doing is they're engaging in mass dragnet surveillance in that area, and they can pull text, they can read text, they can, it's scary what they can get into through a stingray on your cell phone. But I think even as scary as that is, facial recognition technology is entirely its own level of scary. It basically enables the government to, in totality, track us, our individuals, because our faces are unique face prints, and know everything about what we're doing at all times. And right now they can do that without really any checks on that surveillance. And what it really does is it basically turns, us into an open air prison where, we are constantly being monitored, constantly being checked to see what we are and what we aren't doing. And I think, one of the really important things to remember is that another key talking point of the opposition, of those who support this mass surveillance state, is that police are always the good guys. I'm sure you all have seen, or many of you have seen Law and Order, where, They went in a span of 1 hour, a crime occurs, they investigate the crime, they get the bad person, the prosecutors act in good faith, the law enforcement act in good faith. And that's often not the case. I came from the Innocence Project most recently, and we had multiple cases of individuals being incarcerated for decades, not because of accidents that happened along the process, but because of intentional acts by law enforcement, either police or prosecutors, to withhold evidence from the defense that showed that that person was in fact innocent. In one case, we had two clients serve 23 years each for a murder, when in fact, law enforcement knew beforehand that it was likely someone else, and that other person, and they ignored it, and that other person later committed a double homicide. So not only did these two people sit incarcerated for 23 years and government fought tooth and nail to keep them incarcerated, but they ignored very clear evidence that it was likely someone else. And then that person later committed 2 additional murders. And so this notion that the government is always this good, positive actor and can be trusted, I think is just not borne out by the facts. And those are not just unique to, my situation there. Policing is inherently problematic in our country today. I think we see that with, marijuana arrests, for example. We know Black people and white people use marijuana at roughly the same rate. In South Carolina, Black people are 3.5 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. In Charleston, a city that is seen as this very much progressive policing mecca in South Carolina, Black people are over 9 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people. And so the notion that we're going to give law enforcement, who have shown us that they lack the ability to effectively use this with checks, this massive power to kind of map our movements, control our, understand everything about us without any checks, is deeply problematic. And so, from our perspective, it's not only that there's a lack of trust, but also the fallacy of this technology itself. And so I just want to talk a little bit about some of the research around facial recognition technology and the error rates involved with facial recognition technology. And so there's been multiple studies done by government, by universities, by others that show that there is a huge error rate with people of color, with women, with seniors, and with children. The National Institutes for Standards and Technology looked and found that Black and Asian people were up to 100 times more likely to be misidentified than white males. MIT, in the research they conducted, Black women were misclassified 35% of the time. And the ACLU, when we were testifying before Congress around the need for federal guardrails around facial recognition technology, we ran all members of Congress through one of the databases and found, I think it was 28 matches. So it found that 28 members of Congress were falsely matched to having committed a criminal offense in the database. And also, while Black members of Congress are only 20% of Congress, they represented 40% of those people who were misidentified. So it's deeply problematic on multiple levels. And so what we're really calling for right now is basic protections in place. We think that we should hit pause on the use of this technology until we can get these protections in place, including a search warrant requirement, including ensuring that there are due process protections for individuals when they are matched, to ensure that, for example, exculpatory evidence in the context of facial recognition technology that's required to be turned over to the defense would be something like, the algorithm and how that technology is used, so that you know how to challenge whether there's a false match, because we know that there's so often false matches. So making sure that defense know what technology was used, the algorithms that were used, and also the confidence marker that was used, because the programs also include confidence markers, like 1-star to 4-star, for example. And making sure defense have access to that, to have that to challenge. And then also ensure that we have databases that have guardrails around them, so that you can't have bad actors accessing that. I think one thing, going back to what I mentioned about dragnet surveillance in the post 9/11 era, I forgot to mention one thing. The Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board found that there were that dragnet surveillance had not contributed to, or had not led to stopping one single terrorist activity. But what they did find is that NSA officials, or NSA people who had access to the troves of data, were using it to spy on their love interests. And so I think that right there is one of the problems. We need to ensure that we have checks on this. And we're not talking about not using this technology. We're just talking about using this technology in a way that has guardrails to ensure that our privacy is protected, that we don't have to have this false notion of we need to surrender our privacy to secure our liberty. From our perspective, our liberty is strengthened when our privacy is strengthened. So thanks.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Candace. Both of you have brought up some really, really interesting and provocative issues related to this topic. When I was doing research about this, I was really surprised to find out that the database pictures actually included way more than simple mug shots. For some reason, I kind of thought that in this database, it would be maybe mug shots and other like criminal activities that were somehow tagged in the pictures. But then it turned out that passports and driver's licenses and just regular stuff that people put on social media were also in the databases. And one thing I read was that it's likely, based on the Georgetown Law Center's Privacy and Technology Center, that 1 in 2 Americans already have their identity in a facial recognition database. So I guess my first question, because that kind of made me feel a little bit hopeless, is what can people individually do? Is there anything that people can individually do to protect their privacy? A, protect their privacy, like on an individual level, and then B, do if they have an opinion about this topic, if they feel like they need to advocate on the topic, what are some suggested avenues?
Sure, Frank, you want to take it?
Oh, sure. So I think while it may seem bleak, and I think like, Clearview AI, for example, my understanding is they scraped, Facebook, they scraped all these social media platforms, and so have massive troves of information. And there's litigation now challenging the way that they did that, and whether they should be able to kind of keep that information that they probably shouldn't have scraped. And so I think while it does seem bleak right now, there are huge opportunities to fix this problem and to stop it from proliferating any further and to rein it in. And I think some of the coolest things that are happening across the country right now are actually at the local level, where we as community members have the most power. And so like when we're talking about reforming federal legislation, it requires 50 states, or not 50, but the majority of state strategies united towards one goal of moving enough senators and enough House members that you need to pass the legislation, and then having enough power to get the president to sign it or to not kill it. And so when you get to the state level, that kind of the capacity gets a little bit smaller for state level reform. But when we're talking about local level advocacy, we have huge power in our individual capacities to affect change. And I think that's where some of the most amazing reform is happening right now. We're seeing local jurisdictions across the country, from the West Coast to the East Coast, passing prohibitions on the use of this technology by law enforcement. And so, I think one concrete thing that everyone on this call, on this Zoom, could do would be in Rock Hill to, advocate for the prohibition of this technology at the city level, at the county level in New York, or if you're one of the neighboring, and prohibit law enforcement from being able to use this. We as community members have power and control, and we just need to remember that and exercise that. And so there's, if any of y'all are looking for, information or, ways to engage, we, contact us, and we'd be happy to talk through reforms. And I think another thing is just keeping the sunlight on this program. Myrtle Beach, for example, the police department there used a free, I don't know if it was free, but like one of those like.
Oh, you're on mute, Frank. Hey.
Stay on mute.
Sorry.
Frank, stay on mute.
There you go.
Sorry about that. So Myrtle Beach Police Department used one of these term limited free trials of Clearview AI, I believe. And I think it was from February 2020 to April 2021, and they did not make any arrests based on their access to that. And so again, I think it points to this, like, you know, you always need the fancy new car if you want to do things, and that's not the case. You just need to go back to good, you know, investigative work. And also, I think, you know, the corollary to this is that we also need to remember that the way that policing is constructed in the United States right now is deeply problematic. And I think so surveillance technologies is just one, and the police abuse of surveillance technologies is just one component of a much bigger structural problem. And that is that we've turned police into society's solution for everything. Kids misbehaving in school, people, you know, with substance use or mental health disorders, people who are unhoused. You know, we've turned police into the response to that because we as a society have failed to properly address those problems, be it providing, you know, substantial mental health supports, substance use supports, housing supports, you know, strengthening our education system and providing the wraparound supports that people need. And so we need to drastically also reduce not only those police departments' access to this use of this technology without guardrails, but also rein in police departments as a whole and reduce the size, scope, and role of police, and realize that we need to invest in front-end reforms that actually address the problems and make our communities safer. You know, in Charleston, for example, 1 in 3 people are housing insecure. We have an acute shortage of mental health beds. We have the least safe, or some of the least safe pedestrian ways in the entire country where people are being killed, almost on par with homicide rates. And yet we are really not prioritizing any of that. We're giving $1 in $4 to the Charleston Police Department right now, who cannot address any of those problems. You know, they don't have, you know, housing, they don't have mental health supports, they don't have the tools or training to deal with that. And so I think having a collective strategy that is both putting guardrails around this technology, but then also recognizing that we need to reduce the size, scope, and role of policing as a whole, and invest in front-end solutions that will actually make our community safer. You know, there's substantial research that shows that when people have access to housing, crime rates are reduced. When people have access to a living wage, crime rates are reduced. There's no correlation with police and crime reduction. It just doesn't exist. And actually, if you look at the data sets, you see huge upticks, huge decreases in crime at the same time when you see decreases in law enforcement personnel numbers. And so, you know, again, that's where the other side has done a great job of using fear to scare us into believing that we need to have this mass surveillance state, to scare us into believing that we need to have police all over the place if we want to secure our safety and our liberty.
And to piggyback on that a little bit too, we know that this technology is already being used by a lot of private companies. So a lot of large retail stores, for example, Target, Walmart, a lot of them already use very similar facial recognition technology to track their inventory, protect or attempt to prevent criminal activity, right, in their stores. But there's a little bit of a difference between a private organization using it and then the government using it and using your tax dollars, right, to pay for something that is not 100% accurate. And so, as Frank mentioned, I would get involved on the local level. So especially as you're in Rock Hill, look up those city council meetings, look up those county council meetings that York is having. Go to those meetings, especially if you hear that this technology is being discussed, and ask, like, what are the guardrails that are being put in place? Like, even if you don't anticipate living in Rock Hill the rest of your life, it's still important for you to know as a student what is happening in your community and be as active as you can, because honestly, like, government goes to those who show up, right? So as Frank and I, we advocate for stuff all the time at the state house and at the federal level, and we attend a lot of county council meetings too, because if you're not there and you're concerned about this, someone who maybe is not as concerned will be there, right? And so where's that balance of power going to be, and how can your, you know, county council or city council react to what their constituents actually want if they don't know what you actually want? So I would encourage you to show up and ask those tough questions. Ask what guardrails are being put in place. Ask about, you know, if the technology is still in the development stage, are there prohibitions, like Frank mentioned, that could be put in place to say, hey, for real-time monitoring in public areas, can we put a prohibition on that until this is, you know, proven to be successful in other states? What have those case studies been like in other areas that may have used it, and why? Like, learn the why about why your police department or local law enforcement may be looking to use this technology. And is it, as Frank mentioned, is it the shiny new car, right? Or is it something that they wholeheartedly believe could actually be beneficial in the area, and why is that, and how do they anticipate tracking that information to make sure that it is a quality use of the tax dollars that are being spent in the Rock Hill area.
There's so much to unpack here. As both of you are speaking, I'm thinking, what about this? What about that? And I have all these questions. And I think that they're also coming in somewhat on the chat. And so I want to address a couple of things. And one is, I appreciate both of you talking about like practical steps that people can take who are interested in protecting their privacy and making sure that their community's privacy is being protected. We had a question in the chat that asks specifically about children who now have more and more access to technology. And it reminded me of another question that I had as I was just doing the simple research. I thought, so I use the phone face recognition technology on my phone because it makes my life so much better, right? I don't have to remember all my crazy passwords. But am I doing something that I shouldn't be doing? Do the two of you use phone facial recognition technology? Would you allow your children to use it? What are the implications? Candace, you mentioned like the private sector using this. Like what should we on a personal level be doing or not doing with our children, with ourselves, that might protect our privacy in an individual way?
So I think that is a personal choice. I don't use the facial recognition technology, and my kiddos are young. So we don't give them much access, right? Except for stuff that has parental safeguards. So I would say, like, if you are a parent or you have, younger brothers and sisters, like, check on those parental safeguards, but let that be a personal decision of how you want to get into all of your stuff. And I know I try to remember a million passwords too, but in my mind, that's safer than scanning my face every time I want to get into my phone. But yeah, I would say, like, really dig into, and weigh the pros and cons of, is this something is it worth my time or having my face out there, like, to put in the password versus like just scanning my face to get into my phone or my finger, right? There's so much stuff that, like, the office that I'm in Greenville, the prior tenant, they had the finger recognition technology, you scanned your thumb on it to get in for the biometrics. So, thinking through all of that, what is worth it, and making that personal judgment call on whether or not, it's worth it. And I would say for people too, I have a lot of friends who may post pictures of young kids on social media. And then I have friends who don't, for that reason, right? Like, maybe they don't want their kids' pictures out there for a variety of reasons. So definitely consider those if you're a parent or you have younger siblings, or even for yourself. Like, what does that look like? And what are you unintentionally giving someone access to? Whether, you're sharing stuff on TikTok or Snapchat and you think it's going to go away in a few seconds, like, not always the case. There's a warehouse somewhere. So what does that look like, and how can you make sure that you're keeping yourself safe?
Yeah, no, I think I'm in a similar place. I don't use any of that on my phone. I have all the location things. My phone is very basic because I've taken all those off the phone. I keep like stickers over my cameras unless I'm using them. But I think from a ACLU perspective, our concern is really around guardrails for the government. I think from a practical perspective, I think it's important to remember that these technologies can be hacked. And so your microphone can get flipped on, your camera can get flipped on by people. Probably very unlikely, but it can happen. I think one practical thing that we have seen or have heard about happening is, particularly in the COVID context, when kids were sent home with laptops, that there are some concerns about privacy protections lacking in the technology that the kids were sent home with. And so some concerns about that. I mean, I think if you're concerned also with your ability to kind of maintain anonymity online, there's like, browsers like Tor that can, you can use that really reduce the likelihood of people being able to get into your history, your search history, using encrypted communication for, text messages. Those are pretty easily accessible online that you can pull. Tor is accessible. So I think there's programs like that you can utilize to kind of minimize the risk of that. But that's more, I think less so for the government, more so for, just bad actors who are out there that, people do hack stuff and they hold things for ransom. Like that stuff is real. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen.
It's a really good point. We have, and students are coming in with questions about like smart home devices, which I suspect, given your answers, that neither one of you have. Just my guess. But they're asking about those and showing, doing thumbprints and iris scans and things like that. And I think that what's happening right now, and it happened with me when I started researching this issue, is that there's a little bit of an awakening, right? We usually think of these things as just a part of our lives, but as we think about how that information is stored and protected, it really opens up this whole new world that maybe we're not really thinking of. Which brings me to another question that was raised in the chat and that I also had on my list, which is, this trade-off. I think that Frank talked about it a little bit, but we know we want security. We want to feel protected in our society. We want our police to be able to do their jobs as effectively as possible. And so I guess, where is that trade-off between having that and also being willing to give up a certain amount of our data? And like, how as a society can we grapple with that, and where do you fall on that spectrum?
Candace, you want to go or you want me to go first?
You can go first if you want, doesn't matter.
Cool. Yeah, I think that is one of the, and this is really where it gets into the narrative and just how well the other side has created a narrative to make us believe that policing makes us safer. And that giving up giving up our privacy in this technologies in the post 9/11 era, for example, is necessary to make us safer. And so if you look at policing, for example, I think particularly as white people, we're brought up to believe that police are there to make us safe. I think that's, where I grew up, police were there to, quote, protect and serve. That's kind of the rhetoric that we were taught as kids. And I think if you actually start looking into looking at the history of policing and recognizing that in South Carolina, for example, the home of the first policing agency in the entire country was Charleston, and its origin was as a slave patrol to kind of maintain slavery as an institution in Charleston. And if you look at policing's evolution since then, it evolved from being a slave patrol to enforcing convict leasing system, to enforcing Jim Crow, to enforcing the war on drugs. Policing has always been about power and control over controlling oppressed communities for the benefit of a small set of community, particularly kind of white establishment people. And so if you recognize that as actually the history of policing, which is fairly well documented, and then you actually look at how policing function today, I think it's really clear that policing is really not the public safety protector tool that we're taught that it is. And so, for example, we're doing a really deep dive campaign into policing in Charleston right now. And Charleston, nationally, I guess, and this is kind of weird in this more informal, like not going back and forth, but often ask people like, how much, what do you think the percentage of policing is for, violent versus nonviolent arrests? And I think, people often think that police are spending the vast majority of their time going after violent offenders and making arrests for violent offenses. Nationally, it's about 5%. About 95% of policing is low-level offenses like marijuana possession, open container of alcohol. Looking at Charleston, it's slightly better from a police standpoint. It's 85%. So they spend 85% of their time arresting people for low-level offenses like marijuana possession and open container of alcohol and loitering. And so I think that right there shows that policing is not this public safety tool. It is there to kind of maintain a social order. That's why it was created. That's really its role, that it's maintained. And again, even when looking at violent crime, recognizing that policing is reactive. They don't stop murders from happening. They react when murders happen. And so if we really want to truly care about public safety, then we really need to start looking at the underlying causes of crime and recognizing that that's, the kind of the systems of poverty that our public policies have intentionally created. And so the lack of housing access, the lack of living wage, the lack of access to services, quality education, et cetera. And so if we really want to front end, make our community safer, and the data supports this quite clearly, we need to invest in those front end solutions. And I think another really important thing to remember in this kind of notion of like, do we surrender our safety to secure our liberty, or do we surrender our privacy to secure our safety, is that they've also, the opposition has also done a really good job of creating this notion that we need to be so focused on crime rates and crime. And we need to recognize, I think, that crime is an artificially curated construct by law enforcement. And a couple of examples of that. One is that we have divorced crime from harm. And what I mean by that is, if we were focused on harm reduction, then, take marijuana, for example. Marijuana kills no one. Cigarettes kill about 480,000 people in the United States every year. Yet cigarettes, which kill almost 500,000 people, anyone over 18 can walk to their corner store and pick up. In South Carolina, over 30,000 people are arrested every year for marijuana possession. And so we're not focused on harm reduction. We just have these artificial constructs of crime that we are wed to, always thinking about. And so if there's an uptick in crime, we fail to kind of think about that, is there actually an uptick in harm, and is there a way to kind of reduce the harm? I think another great example of that is wage theft. Wage theft destroys families. It keeps people from being able to put food on their table, roof over their head. It is a mass problem in this country and in South Carolina. Wage theft counts for more than larceny, burglary, robbery combined. If you add up larceny, burglary, and robbery combined, you would not get to the amount of money that is taken by people every year through wage theft. And yet, if you actually look at the resources put in, we have our prisons and jails full of people for larceny, burglary, and robbery. We have almost no one and no resources invested into dealing with wage theft. And so I think it's getting away from this notion that we need to focus on crime rates and moving towards the harm reduction model. And at the same time, recognizing that crime is also the construct of how we police. And so police certain things, certain times, in certain places. And marijuana is, again, another great example of this. Black people and white people use marijuana at roughly the same rate. Black people in South Carolina, 3.5 times more likely to be arrested. And so crime rates, again, are artificially flawed because policing is used in a very destructive way, and in a way where law enforcement get to decide how they police, when they police, and who they're policing. And it's also important, I think, to remember that crime also doesn't include the myriad abuses that police engage in daily, and that our corrections officials engage in daily, that are in fact crimes under the code, assault, illegal search, et cetera, that are never counted because police don't count their own offenses. And so I think it's important to recognize that the way we've been brought up to think about crime as this construct of how we are safe or not safe, and then we really need to kind of move towards this harm reduction model. And so technology is the same way. We're not saying don't use the technology. We're just saying that there needs to be guardrails in place that, ALPRs can serve a very valid purpose when they're used for Amber Alerts, senior alerts, things of that nature. But that creating these databases is completely, unacceptable, unnecessary, undermines our basic liberties, and creates the potential for abuse down the road by law enforcement bad actors.
I want to go back real quick to how we started this conversation and talking about the Fourth Amendment and the ratification of the Fourth Amendment. So our founders, when they ratified that, or by ratifying it, I guess I should say, they really sought to prevent the practice of general warrants, which were abused by the British government. Unfortunately, so many of the surveillance practices that are currently utilized by law enforcement really have expanded to essentially become general warrants, which we were initially trying to get rid of when our country was founded. So, while we believe, and Americans for Prosperity believes, that there may be some reasonable exceptions to the Fourth Amendment for national security purposes, the Constitution and the Supreme Court precedent have made it clear that there's no type of domestic criminal conduct really serious enough to justify a violation of someone's constitutional rights. And so even with these technological innovations, there has popped up what's called the third party doctrine. And so this doctrine essentially says that when someone voluntarily gives their information to a third party, such as, let's think, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, a variety of other applications that you might use on your phone, that when you voluntarily give them their information, that the government doesn't really have to get to secure a warrant because that's going through a third party, right? And so that really leads to the conversation of what is the definition of a third party, who gets to use that communication, And some people have their profiles set to public versus private. Is there a difference there when it comes to the government? If you have a public profile, can they look in on it? If it's private, do they need to actually have a warrant? And so when thinking about this and going back to the question about, rights versus privacy, we at Americans for Prosperity believe that the state and federal domestic investigations of criminal conduct should really avoid extraordinary investigatory practices that don't issue a warrant to begin with. So if there's a valid warrant by a judge, let's say all bets are off, right? They can use whatever means necessary. But if there's not a warrant, then honestly, we need to really rein that back in and say, like, why are we using this technology to begin with? And that individuals should have a reasonable expectation of privacy from their government, just looking in on their everyday activities. And we want to make sure that as all of these technologies are advancing, as law enforcement is looking to implement the use of this technology, is this something that the Supreme Court can even keep up with, right? So if they're going to be ruling on a case that comes before them, is there enough precedence when that case gets there that they would be able to actually rule on whether or not someone has standing to say that their rights were violated, or that no, the LEOs were able to use this technology for whatever reason for another precedent. So making sure that our courts are able to keep up with the case law fast enough to match these technological advances that we're seeing, so that they can really help provide our law enforcement officers with those clear and actionable standards to be met with. And if it's something that they rule on, or something that they say, hey, there is, the Constitution can be interpreted this way, right? That they can use certain things. What does that look like? And how can we make sure that laws are written in a way that they're not violating their own case law, or they're not violating precedents that may have been set before them as well?
Thank you. Thanks to both of you on that. And that's really interesting. I appreciate you bringing that up at the end, Candace, because I was looking at some of the case law that already exists, like police can't track somebody's car, for example, just sticking a GPS device on it without actually getting a court order. So, when you think about how is that different than accessing their Facebook page, or is it different? And how much privacy can we actually expect in the public sphere, online and in person? Like, where does that privacy actually end? Those are really interesting cases that I think have already occurred and that are going to need to occur. But like you said, keeping up with the changing technology, I think, might be some of the hardest part of all of this. We've had a student who asked how they can get in touch with each of you if they want to get in touch with you. So just while we're talking, if you want to put any contact information in the chat, I think that would be great. And then we've also had a series of questions about, again, like private companies using your information. Are they allowed to sell it? Which, Candace, you just kind of answered. So be aware, everybody, when you give your information to Instagram or Facebook or whoever, they can use it in other ways and give that information to law enforcement people. But somebody else wanted to know, how is facial recognition technology different than DNA? And there were some things that people have said, like, well, a DNA match system used to be really controversial as well. And now it's just accepted that the law enforcement is going to use it appropriately. Aren't we kind of headed toward that same direction with facial recognition technology? How is it different than DNA matching?
I think that I saw that question in the chat. I think it's a great question. I think it gets to a narrative that has been painted, often in the popular media and in kind of Hollywood and television, that DNA is this this like amazing tool that will help us solve crimes. And I think, coming from the innocence world, where DNA is a very important tool for exonerations, I think one thing that we've also learned the hard way is that DNA is a tool to help exonerate people. It is inappropriate if it's used as the sole reason for convicting someone. And so what I mean by that is that DNA can show that, you weren't at the crime scene, that you weren't, you weren't on the weapon that was used for the murder, for example. But what DNA, and so that can help exonerate someone. It can be a piece of evidence in the chain that moves towards an exoneration. But what at the same time, I remember, I think it was Maryland a while back. So this is getting into the death penalty debate a little bit, but the death penalty abolition movement has moved through kind of many, ups and downs and strategies. And I think one strategy that was pushed a few years back was this notion that, the death penalty really should be reserved for the worst of the worst. And we just need to make sure that we set it up in a way where it is absolutely accurate in its application. And so one of the ways that was pushed to make it absolutely accurate, and I think it was Maryland that pushed this before they moved to abolition, was they basically passed legislation that required either a confession, I think it was, video of the murder happening, so like closed circuit television of the murder that clearly showed, or DNA evidence. And I think what we really learned in the wake of that was that DNA evidence, again, can be used to help exonerate, but just because I'm my DNA is in the room I'm sitting in right now. It's on the table, it's on the computer. But that doesn't, if a murder happened here 3 days from now, my DNA would still be here, but there's no way that you can use that to positively link me to the crime. And so I think it's important to remember that it can't be used as this affirmative tool, but it can be used as one tool in moving towards an exoneration. And I think the same with technology. It's this kind of the notion that technology itself is going to solve problems and make our community safer. In the absence of actual investigative work, in the absence of actual, prioritizing the kind of data solutions that show us what can make our community safer, I think is what the government and what some are trying to push, but it's just not an accurate narrative.
And I would say too, with the DNA, the technology that's used there has been around significantly longer, right, than this facial recognition technology that's coming out. And so when you're looking at, and Frank mentioned earlier, they're using the facial recognition technology in Myrtle Beach, and that hasn't really changed, right, how their operating systems work, right? And so when we're looking at those types of things to say, like, is someone's DNA there? Has that DNA been, could it have been altered, right? What does that look like? And versus facial recognition technology, which you could be, in the back of Professor Moyan's screen, right? If that wasn't a background there and you're walking through and could your face be picked up there? Is a much different situation than I think the way that the DNA is being used to help exonerate people at this point.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Several people had questions about legislation and timing. So is there any legislation that's pending at the federal level or at the state level? And can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, at the federal level, there's been ongoing efforts over the years to basically hit pause on the use and expansion, the use of surveillance technologies by the government until the basic protections around warrant requirement, around prohibition on just the mass use of it in public spaces, around the due process protections, and around the kind of checks on who has access and where that information is stored. So that legislation exists at the federal level, and I could, I don't have it right in front of me right now, but if anyone reached out, I could put them in and connect them with that. At the state level, there have been a number of bills. I think Todd Rutherford has the majority of the bills right now that deal with a whole host of surveillance technologies, from ALPRs to Stingrays to kind of a holistic fix-all, kind of catch-all surveillance privacy protection bills. And so I would, those bills will again be up this next session. They're bills that we all support. If you reach out, I could give you all the bill numbers. I don't have them right in front of me right now, but there's a whole number of them. And I think that gets to the point, and I know this is Constitution Day, and I think one of the problems is that, some issues require us to kind of think differently about how we approach the issue, and that, the Constitution has not caught up to where technology is right now. And so, we've seen some progress with, as Candace mentioned, with third-party doctrine and limiting that for cell surveillance technologies or for cell tower searches. But the kind of overall scope of technological advances continues to outpace the law. And so I know in other states, for example, what we've tried doing, and that's one of the things that one of the bills that Representative Rutherford tries doing, is it's kind of a holistic kind of reimagining privacy protections in the digital age legislation. And so it's kind of creating new principles that are based in kind of the scope of current technology. And also trying to foresee where we think technology may go and trying to kind of think through protections that we can get in place in the front end. And I think it's really important as kind of lawmakers that lawmakers think about this in that more holistic way, that we can't just go after stingrays, or we can't go after ALPRs, we can't go after facial recognition, because it's just spinning out of control faster and faster and faster. And we need to kind of think holistically about how we get in front of this and put protections in place before this stuff gets rolled out.
Absolutely. And I know this may seem a little contradictory since we're talking about tracking and recognition, but the South Carolina legislature has a great app that's free that you can download to your phone so you can track this legislation that's going through the State House. So you can put in a keyword search and then or the bill numbers, we can send over the bill numbers to Professor Moyon. And then anytime, even if it's a room change, you will get a text message that talks about where the bill is, right? There's been a co-sponsor added, or there's a committee hearing coming up and here's the room number, whether or not you can testify. So as bills are popping up at the State House, and if your class schedule allows, I encourage you to testify. They're allowing in-person testimonies and virtual testimonies. So that's something that you could potentially set up, and it's through Zoom, just like this, for a lot of the virtual testimonies, or send in a written testimony as well. So the app is called SC Legislature, and it looks like a little Minuteman on the app, and it's free to download. And you can put in your address. You can put in Winthrop's address and see who your state house reps are, who your state senators are, and follow what they're doing. And as Frank mentioned, Todd Rutherford in the State House, he is working on a lot of this legislation. So you can even, look him up in the app and follow what he's doing on this, and let your state officials know where you stand. And that's a really easy way to kind of track what's happening in Columbia. And so a great opportunity for everyone to get engaged on these issues and to continue to follow up on this issue as well. And just making sure that, if whether or not you believe facial recognition technology is something South Carolina should have, or what they're doing on criminal justice reform in general, or First Amendment free speech issues, a great way and easy way for you to track what's happening in Columbia.
That is great information. Thank you for sharing it. I kind of grinned when a student wrote in that she just used her Face ID to download the app, and she feels really bad about that now. So I think that if nothing else from this event, many people will recognize the ways that this technology is now pervasive in our lives, where we probably did not really notice it before, or if we did, it was purely a convenience. And so I appreciate both of you taking the time to talk about it. I know that we have students who, might have come at this from all sorts of different angles. You might just be simply interested in your privacy and what the Constitution says and allows, and what we're seeing happening right now in the private and public sectors. You might be a protester, somebody who wants to get out there and march about certain issues, and now you're thinking about how this issue relates to you in that way. You might be somebody who travels and goes to the airport and realizes that there's cameras everywhere, and you're pretty much giving up your identity every time you travel, or to a sporting event. And so how long is your identity being held by a private company or a public entity when you hand it over? Those are all issues that we're dealing with on a daily basis that are sometimes invisible if you don't actually think about them. So our two speakers today, Frank and Candace, I really appreciate you taking your time to talk with us about this. I know some students think about this a lot. I think other students are now starting to think about it in the ways that it really is pervasive in their lives. So I appreciate both of you being here and being willing to discuss this with our students. I think it's so telling that this issue affects people from the far left to the far right. Right. And no matter where you are on the political spectrum, you probably have an opinion about this, and it might be a strong opinion. So if you do, you should definitely let your legislator know about it. Like Candace just mentioned at the end, it's really important for them to know how you feel about it. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our students and guests and everybody who could attend today. I hope you enjoyed this event. Our speakers have put their email addresses in the chat. So if you want to follow up with them with questions, or if you want to follow up with me, we would love it. And we hope that you take this issue with you when you leave the room and think about it at least in the next couple of days and share your thoughts and opinions with your friends and colleagues about it. So thank you to everybody for being here. And students, you are welcome to go on and get your lunch and go to class. And we will stay on just for a few more minutes to debrief, but we thank all of you for being here. And you're getting lots of thanks in the chats.
Thank you all.
Thank you guys. Have a great day.
So thanks to the two of you for doing that. There's so much more that we could discuss.